The morning Ethan Mercer signed the divorce papers, his hands did not shake. That was the part that would haunt him later. Not the act itself, not the cold formality of the occasion, not even the silence that followed, but the terrible, unforgivable steadiness of his own hands as he slid those papers across the marble table to the woman who had loved him longer and more faithfully than any person he had ever known or deserved. He had rehearsed this conversation for weeks. He had told himself it was the logical choice, the mature one, the necessary one, the kind of decision a man of his position eventually had to make if he was going to keep growing, keep moving, keep becoming the person the world had apparently decided he was meant to be. He was 44 years old, the founder and chief executive of Mercer Global, a company now valued at $9 billion. His name appeared on the covers of financial magazines. He moved through rooms where decisions were made quietly and without witnesses that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. He had built something extraordinary from almost nothing, and somewhere along the way, in the long, dazzling climb from nobody to someone, he had convinced himself that the woman sitting across from him no longer belonged in the life he was building, that she was part of an earlier chapter, that the story had moved on, that he had moved on. He believed this completely. He had worked very hard to believe it. Margaret Mercer sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a soft gray dress, the kind she always chose on quiet mornings when the day had not yet asked anything of her. No jewelry, no performance. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and her brown eyes were steady and calm in the way they had always been, the way that had somehow, in recent years, begun to feel like a mirror he did not want to look into for too long. She picked up the papers. She read every page. Slowly, carefully, the way she did everything in her life, without rushing, without drama, with a patience so complete it carried its own quiet form of dignity. Ethan watched her and waited for the reaction he had steeled himself for, the tears, the accusations, the anger that would make him feel justified in what he was doing, the confrontation that would transform this moment into an abandonment, into an ending that both parties had chosen. He needed that from her. He had counted on it. Instead, she set the papers down on the marble. She folded her hands again in her lap, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes that had never once looked at him with anything less than complete honesty. "Is this truly what you want?" she asked. Not an accusation, not a plea, not a performance of devastation designed to change his mind, just a question, spoken so quietly and so gently that it landed harder than any raised voice could ever have. Ethan looked away. After 11 years of marriage, he could not hold her gaze for this. "Yes," he said. The word was barely a word at all. Maggie was quiet for a moment that seemed to last much longer than it was. Then she picked up the pen, and she signed her name, Margaret Eleanor Mercer. Every letter written with the same unhurried grace she brought to everything she had ever touched in her life. She slid the papers back across the marble toward him and stood. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Ethan," she said softly. Then she walked out of the room. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried as always. He heard the quiet click of the guest room door, and then there was nothing but the sound of the city far below, and the enormous, hollow silence of a man who had just gotten exactly what he had asked for, and could not understand, not yet, why it felt so much like loss. He told himself he felt nothing. He was almost convincing. 11 years earlier, Ethan Mercer had been no one. A 23-year-old with a business plan drawn on notebook paper, a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner, and an apartment so small the kitchen table served as his desk, his dining room, and the place where his dreams lived when they had nowhere else to go. He had met Margaret Hayes at a bookstore on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October. She was sitting in the corner chair by the window, completely absorbed in whatever she was reading, completely unaware of him or anyone else in the room. Her tea had gone cold on the small table beside her, and she had not noticed. He had thought she was the most quietly beautiful person he had ever seen, not because of how she looked, though she was lovely in the way that some people are lovely without trying, but because of how utterly still she was in a world that never stopped moving, how entirely at peace with herself she seemed, how completely enough. He had invented a reason to speak to her. She smiled and closed her book and given her full and unhurried attention. And that was the moment, though he would not understand it for many years, when Ethan Mercer had been saved by something he would later be foolish enough to throw away. She believed in him before the company had a name. She worked as a librarian while he chased investors up and down the city. She made dinner at midnight when he came home defeated and too tired to speak. She sat beside him at 2 in the morning during the weeks when the numbers refused to add up, and the dream felt not just distant but foolish, the kind of thing a more practical person would have abandoned long before. She never complained. She never expressed doubt where he could hear it. She never once suggested, even gently, that perhaps there was another path. She simply stayed. And because she stayed, he kept going. Because she believed he had something to believe in. The company grew. The investors arrived. The money came in waves so large and fast that Ethan barely had time to understand what was happening before he was standing in a world he had once only been able to imagine. And slowly, so slowly he never noticed it happening, he had begun to leave Maggie behind inside it. Not all at once, not with any single cruel decision. But the way light fades in a room when no one thinks to replace the bulb, gradually, quietly, until one day you look up and realize you have been sitting in the dark for a very long time. Lauren Ashworth arrived at Mercer Global 3 years before the divorce. She was 36, the new vice president of strategy, brilliant and polished and entirely at home in the world Ethan now inhabited. She understood boardrooms and leverage and image the way Maggie understood books and early mornings and the particular silence of a house where someone is content. She understood Ethan's ambition in a way that felt, at the time, like being truly seen by someone who recognized your full dimensions. She began saying things, small things at first. Observations slipped sideways into conversations so that they didn't feel like suggestions. That he had outgrown his marriage. That a man of his position and his vision needed a partner who could stand beside him in the world he was building, not the world he had come from. That Maggie was sweet, that Maggie was good, but that sweet and good were not enough for a man like Ethan Mercer anymore. That he deserved more. Little by little, the way water finds the hairline cracks in stone and works its way inside over seasons and years until one day the stone simply gives, those words found their way into him. Until one morning he woke up and realized he had stopped being a husband and started being a man who was waiting for permission to leave. So he asked for a divorce, and Maggie gave it to him, without a fight. Without a single word of anger or recrimination, without making him earn it or suffer for it, or even explain himself fully. And somehow, in a way he could not have articulated then, that was the cruelest part of all. 3 weeks after the papers were signed, Daniel Holt called and asked to meet in person. Daniel was Ethan's oldest friend and the company's chief legal advisor, a careful and measured man who chose his words like a surgeon chooses instruments, with precision and full knowledge of the damage careless handling can cause. When Ethan arrived at their usual table at the private club downtown, Daniel was already there with a leather folder in front of him that he did not open immediately. He looked pale. He looked like a man carrying something very heavy who was trying to determine the right way to set it down without causing damage. "I need to ask you something first," Daniel said, "and I need you to listen before you say anything." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Go ahead." "Did Maggie ever talk to you about her family?" Ethan frowned. "Her parents died when she was young. She was raised by an aunt in Vermont. She studied literature at a small college on a scholarship. Daniel, I know her history." Daniel opened the folder. He turned it so Ethan could see the top document, a photograph. A white-haired man in his late 70s photographed at what appeared to be a private estate somewhere with a green horizon and no neighbors visible. Patrician, composed, still. The kind of face that belonged in rooms where consequential things were decided quietly and without record. Beneath the photograph was a name. William Arthur Hayes III, founder and principal of Hayes Capital Group. Estimated net worth $4.3 trillion. Famously private, no public family, One surviving child, identity withheld at family request for more than 2 decades. Ethan stared at the page. The room seemed to tilt very slightly in a way he could feel but not explain. "What is this?" he said, and it was not quite a question. Some cold and certain part of him already knew the shape of what was coming. "Maggie's father," Daniel said quietly. "William Hayes has been alive this entire time. He is 82 years old, Ethan, and 3 days ago his legal team contacted our firm. With the divorce now finalized, Maggie's status as a private individual changes under the terms of the family trust. William Hayes intends to formally and publicly acknowledge his daughter for the first time." The silence between them had weight. It had texture. "She knew," Ethan said. "She has always known," Daniel said. "She left that world voluntarily at 22, completely and without condition. She wanted a real life. She wanted to be known and loved for who she was and not what she came from. She asked her father to wait. He waited, Ethan, 11 years, the entire length of your marriage. He waited because she asked him to, because she was trying to protect something she believed was worth protecting." Ethan sat very still. He was thinking about the apartment, the small kitchen, Maggie coming home from the library with groceries she had calculated to the dollar because the budget required it, and never once mentioning the calculation out loud. He was thinking about a Tuesday morning in spring of 2019 when the company had been 4 days from complete collapse. 3 banks had declined emergency bridge loans in the same week. The payroll account was empty. 2 of his senior directors had begun quietly updating their resumes. Ethan had sat at the kitchen table alone until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at a spreadsheet that represented, in clean, unforgiving columns, the end of everything he had spent a decade building. Maggie had come downstairs sometime after 2. She had not asked him to explain. She had not offered solutions or optimism, or the kind of cheerful reassurance that would have felt like an insult to the reality of what he was facing. She had simply made him tea and sat down beside him and placed her hand over his on the table and stayed there in the silence with him because she understood, as she always had, that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can offer another is simply the fact of their presence in a dark hour. 1 week later, an anonymous wire transfer appeared in the Mercer Global Operating account. The amount was precise and strategic, large enough to cover 4 months of payroll and bridge operating costs, large enough to buy him the time he needed to restructure, renegotiate, and survive. Ethan had spent years quietly crediting it to a silent early investor he had never been able to identify or trace. He looked at Daniel now across the leather folder and the photograph of a man whose name he was only now hearing for the first time. "The money," he said. His voice had lost something. 2019. Daniel nodded, once, slowly, the way you nod when you are confirming something that cannot be taken back. "Yes, she saved the company. Yes, Ethan, she did." He pressed both hands flat against the table surface. He needed to feel something solid beneath him, something that was not moving. "And she never said a word?" "She didn't want you to know," Daniel said. "She wanted you to believe you had done it. She wanted that to be yours." He drove to Vermont the following morning, 6 hours alone on the highway, with no music and no phone calls and nothing but the road unrolling ahead of him, and the green of early summer on either side, and the full accumulated weight of what he now understood pressing down on him with a patience that felt almost biblical, the way certain consequences wait for you to be ready before they arrive in full. She was at the farmhouse her aunt had left her. White clapboard siding, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, a garden along the south-facing wall that had been recently tended, the rows neat and deliberate, and flowers along the border that had been planted by someone who understood that beauty is not a luxury but a form of nourishment. Simple and real, and nothing at all like the world Ethan had spent a decade building around himself, like a monument. She was sitting on the porch with a book open in her lap when he turned up the gravel drive and stopped the car. She looked up. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had already made her peace with something very difficult and was living quietly and with intention on the other side of it. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there before. She was thinner than he remembered. He noticed these things with a clarity that felt like punishment, the sudden return of sight to a man who had been choosing not to see. Ethan got out of the car and walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. He did not go further because he understood, without it being said, that he had not yet earned the right to come any closer. "I should have called first," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He stood there in the afternoon light with everything he needed to say arranged nowhere in particular, just loose and aching and impossible to order. "Why didn't you tell me," he said finally, "who you were, what you came from, any of it?" Maggie held her book with both hands and looked at him with those steady eyes that had never once been dishonest with him, not in 11 years, not even at the end. "Because I wanted you to love me," she said. "Not my father's name, not his money, not what I could have given you if I had chosen to use it that way. I wanted you to love me, just me, the way I was." "I did love you," Ethan said. And standing there at the bottom of her porch steps in the Vermont afternoon, he understood for the first time that this was completely and irreversibly true. He had loved her. He had simply, stupidly, catastrophically loved other things more, or told himself he had, which in the end produced the same devastating result. "You stopped," she said simply, not with anger, not with bitterness, with the same clean and honest directness she had always brought to every truth she ever told him, because she had never learned how to be anything other than honest with him, even when the truth asked something painful of her. He sat down on the bottom steps without asking if he could. He pressed his face into his hands. The sound of the lake came through the trees, a bird somewhere that didn't know or care about any of this. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan Mercer had nothing. No strategy, no prepared response, no managed version of himself to present to the situation. Nothing. Just the weight of what he had done, and the particular cruelty of understanding it fully only now, when understanding it no longer changed anything that mattered. After a long while, he looked up. "There's more I don't know," he said. "Isn't there?" Maggie looked toward the water through the trees. "The hospital research grant in 2021, that was mine. The scholarship your logistics director's daughter received to study nursing. The community center near your first warehouse on the south side. The literacy program your company partnered with 3 years ago, without anyone knowing where the founding contribution originated." She paused. Her voice was steady and without performance. "I never wanted recognition. I just wanted things to be better. For you. For the people whose lives touched yours, without you always seeing them." He turned and looked at her fully. This woman who had given everything she had, including the quiet use of an inheritance that most people would have announced from every available surface, not to build a monument to herself, but to make the world around the man she loved more whole, more dignified, more human, without a signature. Without a single word. "I threw all of this away," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said, "you did." She did not soften it. She did not reach for his hand. She simply told him the truth, because she had never known another way to love him, even now, even here, even in this. He stood eventually. He straightened his jacket from old habit, old armor for a man who had no armor left and no longer deserved any. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. He did not mean a foundation or a donation or any gesture measurable in dollars or press releases. He meant something smaller and more desperate than any of that. Maggie looked at him for a long moment with those brown eyes that had first looked at him in a bookstore on a rainy afternoon when he was no one and had never once in all the years since looked at him as anything less than someone worth seeing. Be better, that's all. Just be better than you were. He nodded. He walked back to his car. He did not look back, because he understood that if he did, he would not be able to leave, and she had earned the quiet life she had chosen for herself on the other side of him. She had earned it 1,000 times over, in ways he was only now beginning to fully count.
The Margaret Hayes Foundation opened its first 4 libraries 8 months later, rural communities in Vermont, Montana, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Small buildings with tall shelves and large windows, and good light falling across reading chairs sized for children, and benches wide enough for grandparents to sit and read aloud. Within 2 years, there were 23 libraries. Within 4 years, 61. Ethan attended every single opening. He stood in the back. He never gave speeches. He never allowed himself to be photographed for the occasion. He just watched the children come through the doors for the first time and run their small fingers along the spines of the books the way children do when they understand that something extraordinary and entirely their own is being offered to them without condition or cost. He thought about Maggie every single time. He thought about a corner chair by a rain-streaked window and a woman with cold tea and a book she had not looked up from until he had given her a reason to. He restructured Mercer Global to include a social impact division that became, within 3 years, the largest corporate literacy initiative in the country. He simplified his life in ways that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. Smaller office, fewer staff, more time given to things the market had no mechanism for valuing. Lauren Ashworth had disappeared from his professional world entirely when the story became public, which Ethan noted without satisfaction and without ceremony. Some lessons do not require an audience to be real. On the shelf directly behind his desk, he kept one object that had no financial value whatsoever and which he would not have traded for anything in the world: a paperback novel. Worn soft at the spine from the hands of someone who had read it more than once, dog-eared at page 47 as though the reader had needed to stop there and sit with something before continuing. The book Maggie had been holding on the porch that afternoon in Vermont. She had set it on the railing when she went inside, and he had carried it to his car without making a decision about it, and he had never returned it, and he never would. On the inside front cover, in her handwriting, in ink that had faded softly at the edges with time, were 4 words. 4 words she had written to herself years before he ever turned up that gravel drive. 4 words that had not been written for him, which was precisely why they were the most honest thing he had ever read in his life. Be loved for this. Ethan read those 4 words every morning before the first call came through, and the meetings filled the hours, and the world began asking its usual things of him. He read them and remembered a woman in a gray dress who had understood something about love and life and what it means to give without keeping a record that had taken him far too long and far too much loss to begin to understand. That the truest measure of a person is not what they accumulate in the years they are given. It is not the size of what they build or the volume of what they are applauded for. It is what they give, quietly, faithfully, and without need for recognition to the people and the world around them. Not for return, not for applause, not for the ledger to balance in their favor, but because love, when it is real, does not calculate. It does not negotiate. It does not wait for the right conditions or the right audience. It simply gives, and gives, and gives again, until it has nothing left. And even then, without hesitation, without resentment, without ever once asking to be thanked for it, it finds something more to give. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you may have taken for granted, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet joined the Kind Soul Stories family, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Every week we bring you stories that slow the world down and remind you of what truly matters. Because some truths can only be felt at a quiet pace, and some stories deserve to be carried with you long after the last word has been spoken.